Now that we've worked our way from the gross nervous system into the brain, into the cortex, and down into the lowest levels of our exploration, the neuron, we'll start to work our way upward to the next level, the cortical column. Cortex is divided into columns, or to confuse us all, cortical mini-columns or microcolumns. Columns, mini-columns or microcolumns, depending on what they're talking about. The diameter of a column is around 28 to 40 microns, which is about, it's somewhere between the size and half the size of a human hair. Cells in a 50 micron mini-column all have of the same receptive field. Adjacent mini-columns may have different fields. Each column has roughly 100 neurons each, with a variation in those numbers by about half and double that in the visual cortex. Obviously, there's greater demand for information processing in the visual cortex. There are 200 million of these columns or mini-columns. They're organized into groups called cortical modules, functional modules, or hypercolumns, depending upon the whim or bias of the authors. There are roughly 1 million to 2 million of these cortical modules. We're going to err on the upside of that. Cortical modules and groups of modules do vary quite a bit, but the overall design is the same across the cortex. Nerve fibers, or axons, terminate in one or more of these mini-columns, and nerve fibers from the same region terminate in the same module. But they're not otherwise ordered. In other words, they have to learn their relationship to one another. Cortical modules and cortical columns, like neurons within them, perform the same common function across the cortex. In the literature, this is referred to as the common cortical algorithm, so the how is the same across the cortex. The what, or what they do, is determined by what nerve fibers they're attached to and what part of the body those nerves are attached to, and they adapt to the inputs they receive and the problems that they must solve. As we've said before, the cortex is divided also into 6 layers, so the cortical columns themselves are divided into 6 layers. This is an evolutionary artifact. The cortex is an outgrowth of the region of the hippocampus that creates a model model creatures' feel of their eyes, head, body, and limbs in relation to space. Think of it as your awareness of that body and where all its parts are in relation to all others. This region, which we'll explore later, doubled, folded over, and grew larger and larger until at some point the stem cells that determine the size of the neocortex mutated and tripled. So, as in all things, our ability to remember, predict, imagine, think, and reason as we understand it is an evolutionary extension of our knowledge of our body in time and space. And knowledge of this cortical ancestry is going to help us in a few moments understand the function of these columns. So let's use the Braille analogy because this really helps us understand how neurons and columns work together. So this is a book published in Braille. If you run your fingers over it, you'll find bumps and divots and blank spaces. Think of these as textures or shapes. Patterns of these bumps and divots represent characters. And with practice, as you in real time move your fingers across each block of the texture, you can identify characters. That's essentially what happens in layer 4. Layer 4 is located deeper within the neocortex and is composed of granule cells. Granule cells in this layer receive sensory input and relay it to the adjacent columns. Layer 4 is very thick in the primary sensory cortex, i.e. the primary visual cortex. Over time, characters accumulate in your mind as words. That's what layer 3 does. It accumulates predictions of greater context. Layer 3, this is the external pyramidal cell layer. Pyramidal cells make up this layer. They are called pyramidal because, again, their somas are triangularly shaped. They receive input from other cortical regions and output to other cortical columns. Layers 2 and 3 can be combined when we think about them. They serve as the cortical output layer, the part of the column or the layer of the cortex that participates in voting, competing, and producing information. words accumulate into sentences, and let's pretend a sentence is the same as an object or model, and that's what layer 2 is for. Layer 2 is for objects, and layer 6 is for actions. As for layer 2, because it's one of the outer layers and is composed of granule cells receive inputs, they're called mossy fibers, from the spinal cord and the brainstem. They receive inputs from other areas of the neocortex as well, so think of it as an intracortical association layer. Layer 6 has many different cells types. Its structure isn't homogeneous, so it was called the multiform layer. Its function is receiving and integrating information from the brainstem and outputs to the thalamus. Layer 6 is the position in relation to body layer. I think that's the best way to describe it. The local GPS receiver, maybe. So this layer tells where are you. Layer 5 says how can we coordinate those actions. Layer 4 takes in all the information, organizes it, and we'll see a little bit more later on. And you can unconsciously tell your hand what direction to keep moving and continue receiving the information. Layer 5 then sends instructions to the thalamus to adjust the movement of your hands to continue the predictive stimuli. Layer 5 is another layer of pyramidal cells that make up the neocortex. The cells in this internal pyramidal cell layer are larger than those in layer 3. Layer 5 is involved heavily in assisting in the organization of and making motor movements. Layer 5 is the motor output layer. It sends instructions out from this layer to the motor nervous system. And you associate the meaning of the sentence with the rest of your short and long-term memory, and layer 3 competes for attention, sending that vote out. And if your vote is accepted or wins or survives, then you maintain attention in this column and module. Layer 3, this is the external pyramidal cell layer. Pyramidal cells make up this layer. They are called pyramidal because, again, their somas are triangularly shaped. They receive input from other cortical regions and output to other cortical columns. Layers 2 and 3 can be combined when we think about them. They serve as the cortical output layer, the part of the column or the layer of the cortex that participates in voting, competing, and producing information. The first layer, layer 1, is called the molecular layer. As you can see from the diagram, it has very few neurons and cells. Instead, it is mainly composed of dendrites and axons that extend from lower levels of the neocortex. Across the whole cerebral cortex, layer 1 receives a lot of input from specialized thalamus cells, again maintaining attention during what appears to be the process of association. Layer 1 is rarely discussed in the literature. I'll discuss this briefly later, but my understanding is that it preserves attention during the process of subsequent higher level cortical association. And other columns compete with their votes, first nearby, then across the cortex, trying to fit features, objects, entities together into scenes at whatever resolution, meaning distance, we are focusing our attention. Now let's cover the most basic process of how a column calculates. Diagram 1, on the left side, you see a column with color-coded layers. In diagram 2, next the column layers are abstracted. In diagram 3, we see layer 4. Layer 4 takes the input from the nervous system. As I understand it, the majority of these inputs radiate out of the thalamus. However, nearby connections also enter and exit layer 4. The exception being your sense of smell, which is uniquely directly connected and therefore difficult to regulate. In that layer 4 rectangle, you can see a bunch of dots. And let's pretend that those are synapses that can fire. Some sequence of those synapses fire, causing some sequence of neurons to fire. Layer 4 learns to predict a sequence of sensory motor stimuli, and so that's our first sort of surprise. Instead of storing a set of stimuli, we store a prediction from sets of similar stimuli. And if any of you have used Photoshop, an application that works in pixels, versus, say, Illustrator that works in vectors, our brains work like vectors, not pixels or photographs. We remember the curve of the line, not necessarily the points on the line. So if we repeatedly sense a sequence of points that are close to that line or curve or shape or texture or color, we predict that line, curve, or shape, or texture, or color. Prediction begins all the way down in the neuron. Let's assume 1,000 synapses per neuron. Let's assume about 8 to 15 of those will generate a spike, meaning release an action potential and fire a neuron. Let's assume firing about 20 synapses will create a robust estimation of a unique prediction. That's important. It's this how few synapses it takes to create something unique. So I'm going to put this on the screen. That's 8.2 times 10 to the 59th individual predictions. Now think about that. So now, I don't know if you know much about large numbers, but in operational terms, that's pretty much infinity right there, meaning you can't live anywhere near long enough to use up those permutations. Now, in one column, there are 100 neurons, some number of which are in layer 4. When one cell fires, it tends to recruit only about 1% of nearby cells, so a cell tends to contribute to other cells firing rather than influencing or recruiting local cells. So that means cells work together in even greater combinations to produce predictions. Again, because big numbers are meaningless for all intents and purposes, a single column can identify an infinite set of sequences. And that means it and ones near it can recognize the edge of a table, the curve of a cup or glass, and the different textures of ceramic, metal, wood, skin, or fur. So our goal here is to understand that small, sparse combinations of firings generate accurate information and unique information. So let's look at the next diagram where two things happen. Immediately, that information is transferred up to layers 2 and 3, where just as we predict a line, curve, shape, texture, or color, we'll say fragment for now, we start predicting fragments into features and features into objects. In other words, we accumulate series of fragments in turn into features and into objects. And over time, we get better and better at predicting what is familiar from less and less information. And if we're uncertain, then we don't disambiguate features, and this is interpreted by the cortex as uncertainty. In other words, the sparser a distribution is, the more certain it is, and we can union a less sparse distribution of firings in order to communicate uncertainty. The next sequence in the chain, the next neurons that interpret this, or the next column that interprets it, will judge that uncertainty compared to its own uncertainty. And we can process many, many sensations in parallel within the neurons and within the columns. And the modules can operate in parallel, and the whole cortex can operate in parallel. But we are also going to add something new here, and that's the blue line, the position relative to your body, head, and eye. The fragment, feature, object, scene's position relative to you, where you are the baseline of measurement for everything. This information comes from a little region on the edge of your hypothalamus that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on in our video on orientation, position, space, and location. For now, I'm going to just ask you to recall the hexagonal sphere from the previous videos and just imagine that another part of your brain is calculating and feeding you the information necessary to know the position of the sensation and the object that it's disambiguating. In diagram 5, we see the blue arrow sending the prediction down to the layer 6, which will perform that calculation using what's called a grid cell layer. It means what it sounds like. It calculates where stimulation exists in space in relation to the body and accumulates it there. This helps us understand that while information comes into the center of the column, top of the column tries to solve the problem of what, and the bottom tries to solve the problem of where, and send that solved problem of what and where on to the next columns or regions to use in their calculations. In diagram 6, we see all of this information again continuously updated in a continuous stream of continuing increases in precision in a very vast and in parallel system where the more experience and the more training you have in a sequence of stimuli, the lower the effort and information needed to predict an outcome for ever sparser information. So again, the value of understanding sparsity is that as you learn, you can more accurately predict things that are divergent or very different earlier on in the process. So this is one of the reasons why things get easier as you do them more. You are not only are growing new patterns and you're sequentially forming new neural connections to support them, and you're learning these sequences that are producing predictions that can more quickly come to conclusion about what action it is you need to take. My goodness, I tried to get all that out there. Okay, as for output, layers 2 and 3 offer a prediction. They cast a vote or ship a product. I tend to think of it as they're shipping a product to market to see if it's going to survive. And they send it both locally and to the opposite hemisphere. It's important because we have to coordinate between the hemispheres. And as you know, sensory motor is split between the two hemispheres. So we have to share this information so that both sides get it. Layer 5 tells the thalamus that it has a prediction worthy of attention, and Layer 5 sends motor actions to be relayed to the brain, stem, and spinal cord. So attention functions as the reward for successful prediction, and closing the thalamic circuit, so to speak, allows neural connections to form, strengthen, and grow. And we're going to cover the thalamus and attention shortly. Our brains break problems into massively parallel units of work. Then they aggregate the solutions to those problems, and they do it by competition. Competition speeds disambiguation. So, for example, as you see here, one column might predict a tennis ball in a soda can, another a soda can in a cup, and so on. Two can sort of gang up on one and eliminate one of its candidates. This competition continues, and the survivor gets the attention, meaning survives, for the next iteration. And again, this stimulation is continuing in real time, and these calculations are happening very quickly. So we're forming this circuit of saying attention, 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 and the circuit stays alive and is reinforced during that time. Prediction continues across the regions of the cortex with combining different senses where different sets of sensory motor predictions compete, finding commensurability or not and survival or not. They call this in the literature matching. In other words, if, as you've seen in our globe where we have hexagons, is a hexagram a bad thing? No, it's a pentagram. Okay, so as you see in our hexagons, in our grid formation, if things line up, they are in the same rotation in time and space. And if they match up, they don't conflict too much in time and space, and their stimulations align, we disambiguate them into an object. So whatever survives is made available to us for further comprehension. Now let's decrease our level of resolution a bit and review the cortical algorithm in more general terms. 1. Columns convert sensors to measures. Every sensory cell serves as a measuring device. Your skin is the most obvious one, the inside of your eyes, taste buds, any of the cells in your hearing. Every sensory cell is an independent measuring device. Every nerve produces a stimuli, but all stimuli are roughly the same. They just go on and off. You might go on and off at different frequencies, but they just go on and off. Our region will work together. I think you've probably played that game where you can touch a person a few times lightly on their arm, and they think something is crawling up their arm. That's because the sense of having sparse activations by touching someone's outer arm predicts something crawling up your arm, something that isn't there. If you haven't played that game on someone, please do. It's fun, but it does teach us that we use sparse stimuli to do predictions and produce responses. So every nerve produces a stimuli, but all stimuli are roughly the same, just on and off. It's the origin of the stimuli combined with its on-off activity that provides information. Neurons convert these stimuli into semantically meaningful measurements to us. They're not Chinese characters. They're not abstractions like numbers. They're just vibrations, essentially. And these vibrations are turning to meaningful, or on and off as a vibration, meaningful measurements by searching for patterns that survive competition over time. Competition includes not less than coherence or overlap within nearby cells, performing similar measurements, and coherence over repeated sequences. By way of all this competition of sequences within a fairly narrow window of time and space, millions of these independent stimuli are converted into measurements, and measurements into objects that we can focus our attention upon or act upon if we want to, and even gain more information about. So hopefully that what I've done is with this so far is I've helped you understand our geometry. This focus on geometry is important because we are in fact measuring always and everywhere, creating geometric references in time and space relative to our position and orientation. Now, secondly, we do feature integration. The process of iterative association and consolidation is called in the literature the feature integration model. It says that one of the main functions of visual attention is to bind visual features such as color, texture, shape, orientation, and direction of motion together in coherent objects. But the same applies for touch. I like to cover touch. I think that's more useful for explaining how we see and sense in time and space, and we combine them together, then inferring that from how vision operates. 3, this process of competing predictions is called bias competition. According to this model, numerous sensory or cognitive representations are active in the brain at any given time, but the brain's computational resources only let a limited number of representations proceed through the stages of processing. So what that means is even when you're sleeping, all this processing is going on, and the thalamus, by opening up its attention, allows representations through to you. There's more to this process later on. So the various representations are always competing against each other for access to neural resources. In this competitive environment, attention is a mechanism that can bias selected representations for more elaborate processing or further processing. Now that we've gone through columns, let's summarize. The column is the basic processing unit of the neocortex. Columns disambiguate stimuli into predictions of sequences. Columns remember correct predictions of sequences, not individual sensations. Remembering sequences adds memory timing, and timing is necessary for coordination. Columns receive information and positional information via the thalamus to provide commensurability in time and space. Columnar layers divide the labor of producing predictions of changes in stimuli in time and space. Neurons in columns compete to produce a prediction of relations, fragments, features, and objects. Columns accumulate predictions to produce a prediction, meaning theory, of an object or set of candidate objects. Columns in a module compete or vote to produce a prediction of an object. Modules pass information forward for further integration with information from other modules in a vast parallel process. All of this occurs very fast, again in parallel, in iterations, accumulating, holding, and discarding information that is coherent with each other. The success of each prediction is determined by completion of a thalamic circuit over time. In other words, that's what reinforces it. And finally, let's cover our dimensions. Unlike neurons, there aren't many to cover with cortical columns and modules. We only really need to talk about 3: the physical, the informational, and the logical. The physical consists of the neuron, which is measuring, column, a fragment, layer, which processes an object, or a fragment, layers, projects an object, modules, put together a model, a region integrates it, a network puts together a composition, and the cortex produces what is effectively a simulation in real time. It's a predictive simulation, but it's a simulation. Second, the informational series is sensation turns into sequence, which means time, a fragment, which means space, a feature, which turns into an object, a model, and a category, the entity, and the instance. The logic that's used is competition for repetition, sequence, coherence, integration and overlap, and attention, survival. I hope that was really informative for you. I fought with this and did it multiple times because I didn't want to give too much information nor too little, and I wanted to give multiple ways of looking at the problem, both the physical implementation, an operational view of it, and an analogy using Braille. I figured if I had those three dimensions, I could get across to you how these things work, and the woo-woo of what's going on in the brain would be eliminated. Our next lesson covers orientation, position, space, and location. This is Kurt Doolittle for the Propertarian Institute, and we'll see you in the next lesson.